Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvelous video. Most of the dragons we've spoken about on this channel have been born before the timeline of House of the Dragon even began. Syrax, old enough for Rhaenyra's joyrides. Caraxes and Vhagar, massive. Sunfire, young but still golden and resplendent. Dreamfire and Meleys, old and majestic as they had been before the Great Council of 101 AC. In fact, 5 episodes into the whole thing, we still hadn't seen half of the dragons we've mentioned already, which is what makes it such a refreshing thing to talk about a dragon that was born during the events of the series, not before and, sadly, definitely not after. Vermax is the mount of Crown Prince Jacaerys Velaryon and a part of the last generation of dragons to be born to the Targaryens that could still fly and fight. As a war mount, he might not have accomplished the feats of Balerion the Black Dread, but his life represents the last hurrah of the fabled steeds of the Dragon Lords, and that alone makes it worth talking about him. So without further ado, this is Vermax's origins explored, and spoiler warning, because there will be a lot of those in this video. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Etymology, birthplace, and early years. Vermax was named after a god of Valyria, it seems following the naming tradition of ancient dragon lords. Though we rarely get to know the parentage of a dragon in definitive terms, that is not the case of the children of Rhaenyra Targaryen. The Black Queen's mount was the beautiful and courtly she-dragon Syrax, and each of her sons received dragon eggs born from her own royal steed. Vermax's egg was placed in the cradle of her firstborn son Jacaerys Velaryon, but most people at court expected the egg to not hatch. That's because Rhaenyra's eldest 3 sons, Jace, Luke, and Joffrey, looked nothing like their father Laenor Velaryon, and looked a lot like Rhaenyra's sworn shield, Harwin Strong. It was believed that because they were technically bastards that their dragon eggs would not hatch and thus prove their bastardy in front of the eyes of God and men. How disappointed those people would have been when Vermax's egg hatched and the young dragon bonded with his master-to-be rather quickly. As Rhaenyra preferred to stay at court even after getting married, her son Jacaerys was born in King's Landing, and so was Vermax. At this point, we think it's important to note that we never officially get to know Vermax's coloring. Fire and Blood is not big on detail when it comes to describing any of the dragons that Rhaenyra's sons rode, and we only know about Arax's coloring thanks to the 2021 A Song of Ice and Fire calendar. So we must look to the show for Vermax's coloring, and we must say that they made an interesting choice. Vermax looks a lot like a brindled wyvern. His primary coloring is green, but his belly seems to be pearly white, and his protrusions are a bloody red in hue. His eyes are bright yellow like a lizard's, and judging by the shape of his head, he belongs to the same breed as Caraxes. Brindled wyverns have green and white scales and can grow up to 30 feet long, and if you've seen our video on the anatomy of a dragon, you'll know that wyverns are most likely genetic ancestors to the dragons. So it's intriguing that it was this color that the showrunners decided to give to Vermax, especially because green dragons have a bit of a history of being more vicious in A Song of Ice and Fire. Across the centuries, only 4 green dragons have been recorded in the history books. The first of them feels like a cop-out, but it is Vhagar, whose bronze was practically covered by her blue-green scales by the time she fought in the dance. The second is one of Dany's 3 dragons, that being Rhaegal. Rhaegal is a green and bronze dragon. His scales and crest and horns are jade green, but his eyes are bronze. The third green dragon we know of is Moondancer, the dragon bound to Baelor Targaryen, Prince Jacaerys' betrothed. And now the 4th is Vermax, but we're going to keep him aside for a second here because the first 3 dragons we've named all have another thing in common: their ferocity. Out of Dany's 3 dragons, Drogon is the alpha, there is no doubt, but Rhaegal is the second most vicious. Both Tyrion and Barristan note this when Rhaegal and Viserion join the battle for Meereen, as Rhaegal is far more aggressive than Viserion. When we cover Moondancer, you'll see that she also has a similar disposition, despite being more like Dreamfire in terms of her physical build. And do we need to even talk about Vhagar, the dragon known more popularly as the Terror of the Trident? So accordingly, Vermax is also a dragon who is not to be trifled with, which is evident in the scene where Jace is learning how to master him. Vermax seems to disregard half of Jacaerys' commands and is far more temperamental than the other dragons we'd seen up until that point, if you discount Caraxes, of course. So that is something you should keep in mind going forward, as As a young hatchling and then a young dragon, Vermax most likely stayed with Jace at the Red Keep or laired in the Dragon Pit with all the other Targaryen castle dragons, as he does in the show. It's not confirmed in the books. Despite being a relatively young dragon, Vermax was growing larger every year, nearly reaching the size of sea smoke by the time the dance came about. When Vermax was 6, he was present at high tide for Sir Laenor Velaryon's funeral. The number of dragons that were present at the ancient Velaryon seat that day caused maesters observing the event to dub Driftmark the New Valyria for a day. Thereafter, he stayed with the prince at Dragonstone by royal command, though Vermax would fly Jace to court on important occasions by the time he was large enough to ride. For instance, we would say that Jace arrived to the feast of 127 AC on Dragonback, simply because by that time Vermax should have been old enough to ride, if not fight. At that feast, his rider Jacaerys got into a scuffle with Crown Prince Aegon Targaryen, the rider of Sunfire the Golden. The tension between the two princes required the sturdy hand of the Kingsguard to diffuse, but if dragons truly do feel what their riders feel, then there is no telling what a scuffle between Vermax and Sunfire would have done to the city. Thankfully, tragically, we will never find that out. The last Targaryen dragon in the north, Vermax the Messenger and his role in the Dance of the Dragons. At the outbreak of the Dance of the Dragons, Vermax was the dragon that showed the most war potential out of all the fiery mounts that the Blacks owned, though he had not been blooded in battle yet and had been used to long-distance flights for a while. Perhaps it was for this reason that Queen Rhaenyra Targaryen chose Jacaerys and Vermax to be her envoys to the east and the north. Vermax followed a trail that had been led by Targaryen kings and queens long before him, and was the last dragon to do so. He first flew to the Eyrie, where his rider Jacaerys treated with Lady Jane Arryn. Vermax was the third dragon to visit the ancient castle of the Sky Kings of old after Vhagar and Balerion. Once Jace had managed to win the support of House Arryn by promising to defend the Vale with dragons, he moved on to a location where House Targaryen was last active during the conquest, and even then not directly. When Aegon the Conqueror set out to unite the Seven Kingdoms, the sistermen of the Bite rebelled against their Arryn overlords and crowned Queen Marla Sunderland. The rebellion was only put down when Todden Stark, Warden of the North, marched on the sistermen, and Sir Warwick Manderley led Braavosi war fleets toward the Three Sisters. Queen Marla was deposed and spent her days as a silent sister, and House Sunderland, like much of the rest of the realm, bent the knee. Vermax arrived at the seat of House Sunderland over a century after the fact, making him the first dragon that the sistermen had seen in close proximity. After ensuring the allegiance of the Three Sisters to his mother's cause, Jace took Vermax to White Harbour, which was last visited by Queen Alicent Targaryen and Silverwing half a century ago, and then to Winterfell, which is where his quest becomes more interesting. Not since Jacaerys' Vermithor and Alicent Silverwing and the 6 other dragons they came with had a dragon been seen in the north. Vermax was the first one to appear in northern skies nearly half a century after the Old King's last proper progress, and he would be the last as well. It is said that while Jacaerys and Lord Cragan Stark forged a warm friendship and allegiance in the north, Vermax was repelled by the cold. He grew ill-tempered whenever he came close to snow or ice, much like Queen Alicent Silverwing, who did not wish to fly past the wall when she visited the Night's Watch. We cannot be sure as to how much time Jace and Vermax spent at the ancient fortress of the Starks, but it could not have been for too long, especially not long enough to lay a clutch of eggs, as Mushroom alleges Vermax did. It is not entirely impossible that Vermax laid a clutch of eggs at Winterfell, mind you. Though he seems to have hated snow and ice, Winterfell has a fabled set of hot springs that pump hot water throughout the castle walls, keeping it warm even in the worst winter. If Vermax went into the crypts to lay an egg, it might have been warm enough to create the right environment, but then there is the matter of his gender. We're never told what Vermax's birth sex was, but given the fact that we never hear about him laying eggs verifiably, we can assume that he's a male dragon. Regardless of the gender debate, what cannot be disputed is Vermax was the last dragon to ever fly as far north as Winterfell. Upon his return to Dragonstone, Jace's formidable steed was saddled for war, and sadly, that is where he would also perish. When the fleet being led by Sharako Lohar breaches the Valyrian blockade of the Gullet, Vermax and Jacaerys are the first in the air. Prince and Dragon burned dozens of Triarchy sailors to a charred crisp, but these men had fought Daemon and Caraxes on the Stepstones. This was Vermax's first battle. Experience won the struggle between sailors and dragon, and the Green Fury was brought down by either a crossbow bolt to the eye or a grappling hook around his neck, or both of those things, as reports of Vermax's death are quite jumbled. He was swiftly followed by his rider, neither outliving the other by too long a margin, and thus the dragon who had shown the most promise out of Cyrax's brood had died at sea. Vermax was barely 16 years old. Though his actual effectiveness in combat was not at par with any of the other dragon seeds, his wings accomplished more for Rhaenyra's cause than anyone else's. Jace's diplomatic mission had been a resounding success, with the East and the North being ardent supporters of Rhaenyra until the very bitter end. Cregan Stark honored his pledge to Jacaerys and marched on King's Landing with nearly 20,000 Northmen, and Princess Rhaena Targaryen, Luke's former betrothed, was raised in the Vale until the war was finally over. In terms of the bigger picture, Vermax's wings accomplished much and more for his rider and their mothers, but as a weapon of war, he failed where others would succeed. Words were not wind when the wings carrying them belonged to a dragon, and Vermax was living proof of the same. Marvelous verdict. Having seen how generic Rhaegal and Drogon were in Season 8 of Game of Thrones, it's honestly going to be a breath of fresh air when Vermax reaches the North, just because it'll show you how big of a difference there is between House of the Dragon and its predecessor show. The Green Fury, as we're calling him, is as bold and fiery as his rider. There is no doubt about that, and will become an important symbol of Targaryen rule in the years to come. Because Vermax was the last dragon to implement the will of the Targaryens from King's Landing to Winterfell, his death represents a sort of unraveling of the Targaryen hold on the Seven Kingdoms. House of the Dragon has done a far better job at handling the core storytelling elements of George R.R. Martin's world, and honestly, we just can't wait to see Vermax in action, tragic as it might end up being. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe. Thanks, everyone.
Vermax!